morning, everyone, and welcome to the Department of State. My name is Candace Bates. I'm a Foreign Service Officer, and I currently serve as the Senior Policy Advisor and Regional Team Lead in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. Rahima Kandahari, our Senior Advisor and Director of Operations, could not be here today, but she sends her regards. I bring you warm greetings from my colleagues in GWE scattered throughout the audience, and our co-host, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Each year, on November 25, the U.S. government joins the international community in commemorating the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which begins the accompanying 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. During the 16 Days campaign, public and private sectors and individuals and communities around the world focus global attention on the scourge of violence against women, including child early and forced marriage, female genital mutilation and cutting, domestic and intimate partner violence, and all forms of human trafficking. On this, the 10th day of the 16 days, we are delighted that you could join us in exploring a key component in our efforts to end this global pandemic. The engagement of men and boys are critical partners in preventing and responding to violence against women and girls. My office, the Office of Global Women's Issues, works to ensure that the rights of women and girls are fully integrated into U.S. foreign policy. We help to catalyze a whole-of-government effort to leverage expertise and resources from not only across the State Department, like with our colleagues in DRL or USAID, the U.S. Agency for International and Development, but also across other U.S. agencies. Applying lessons learned from our domestic experience on issues like violence against women, for instance, is key to our diplomatic strategy. We also work closely with civil society and private sector alike, learning from your perspectives, experiences, and innovations on these critical issues. Collectively, we work together to empower women and girls as leaders, peace builders, and formal wage earners in the communities and societies in which they live. We know that violence against women and children has generational impact, affects all people, women, men, boys, and girls, undermining global peace and security here at home and abroad. It weakens the social fabric that binds families and communities together and prevents countries from achieving not only social and political stability, but also economic growth and development. It is essential to engage men and boys as partners in this effort of prevention and response. Effective action requires targeted and nuanced approaches. This morning, we look forward to hearing from our panel of experts on best practices and what we can all do to make sure that violence is a thing of the past. One such approach is the one implemented by Promundo, who has conducted extensive global research and program development around engaging men and boys in gender equality and violence prevention. Promundo is a leading voice for the worldwide effort to establish positive, healthy dynamics between men and women. So I would like to invite CEO and President of Promundo, Gary Barker, to the stage to give an overview of the excellent work Promundo is doing and to show a brief video that highlights just how important this work is. Thank you.
Good morning. Before I show the video, just a couple of words of what it's about, and then what I want to share with you is some reflections. I'm guessing that most of you waking up in the morning are doing a bit like I have these last weeks or months, is we're picking up the headlines and saying which of the mighty men has fallen since I last looked at the newspaper. This wave of what's up with some men has certainly called attention in this country and elsewhere to the dynamics between men and women at the workplace and in our intimate relationships. I don't make a lot of guy friends if I say, men, we have to talk about this. This is about going to the urologist for most men in terms of what we want to talk about on a daily basis. But it is what we need to talk about. As we've been watching women galvanize around Me Too, a lot of men, as we bring up the conversation, want to jump to, but not me. And if we look at the global data that says, yes, the majority of men probably don't use some form of violence against female partners or against women in the workplace and elsewhere, but it's on all of us to think about what the solutions are. And so I'm thrilled that the State Department has invited us to be part of a discussion that says, let's have those uncomfortable conversations about what men and boys have to do with this. I'm going to share some data of what we're looking at of where this violence comes from and how we're trying to use that data and lots of other partners to come up with approaches to say it's got to go beyond this particular moment in our history when we're talking a lot about it and really to go much bigger. But before I start with before starting with any bar charts or graphs or statistics, important to start with a story of one man who participated in our programming in Brazil some years back, who we think illustrates a lot where this violence comes from, the impact that it has, and some ideas of where we go next in terms of prevention.
Meu sonho era ser pai, né? Acho que para alguns o sonho pode ser uma carreira, para outros pode ser viajar para algum lugar, mas eu não. Esse meu sonho sempre foi ser pai, né? Isso para eu mostrar, assim, para eu dar para meu filho talvez que eu não tenha tido. Eu não tive o meu pai do meu lado. A minha relação com meu pai era muito distante, sempre foi, né? Né, a minha mãe, uma vez, quando ele bateu na porta, minha mãe abriu, ele estava alcoolizado, estava bêbado, e deu um soco. Minha mãe ficou uma semana sem sair de dentro de casa, com aquele olho fechado. Ele quebrou tudo, né? Minha irmã mais velha foi até a polícia, aí levaram ele. Porque que na comunidade pregava justamente era isso, né? De questão de que ele tinha que mostrar que ele era homem. Esse homem para ele tinha que ter várias mulheres. Esse homem para ele tinha que beber, ele tinha que ter festa, ele tinha que ter dinheiro. Acho que eu nunca esperei presente do meu pai. Eu queria sim a atenção dele, de sentar com ele, conversar. A gente sair de repente para jogar uma bola. Meu pai nunca estava, né? Nunca estava, nunca aparecia, né? Então isso criava uma certa eu guardava anos aquilo dentro de mim, não uma certa raiva, não é ódio, não era raiva do meu pai, uma certa mágoa, um certo ressentimento que eu tinha do meu pai. Tem um ditado no mundo que diz, né, que se você não colocar as coisas velhas para fora, as novas não tem como entrar. Primeiro eu não falava, não me abria. Eu ficava dentro do meu quarto, digamos assim, trancado. Não, isso aqui ninguém mexe. A partir daquele momento ali, eu vendo a história de cada um, aquilo ali me serviu para que eu pudesse ser curado daquilo.
A história da gente é muito parecida mesmo, né? Porque também meu pai largou a minha mãe, eu tinha 6 anos, né?
Coisas que eu pude absorver dos outros, sabe? Das ideias, dos conceitos das outras pessoas, sabe? Muita coisa assim, do que eu achava de ser pai, mudou e acabou que eu abri. Porque, tipo assim, coisas ruins saíram e coisas boas entraram. Assim que minha esposa, que a Verônica ficou grávida, e ela foi no primeiro pré-natal, eu nunca faltei uma reunião de pré-natal dela, nunca faltei uma consulta de pré-natal. Me sentia mais, o meu filho se sentir mais próximo de mim. Papai. É? O filho onde? Ele tá comendo. Papai. Eu falei, ó, filho, papai tá aqui, sabe? Mesmo ele não entendendo isso, mesmo que ele não tivesse essa ideia. Vou ser um pai presente, sabe? Que eu me importo com meu filho, que eu me importo dele, antes dele estar nos meus braços, né? Papai. Isso Isso. Assim. Acho que nenhum para o mundo tem ideia do quanto isso é poderoso. Essa arma é poderosa. A arma que eu falo, não vou falar arma, vou falar essa ferramenta aqui na comunidade. Tanto para os homens e também para as mulheres, para as esposas. Porque isso não gera benefício só para a criança, para os filhos, não só para o pai, mas também com relação à mulher. Essa ferramenta é poderosa diante de uma comunidade de transformação de mentalidade, né? A chuva não vem num monte, ela vem com pingo, 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 então torna aquele rio forte.
Wanted to start off with it because precisely it gets at the point of thinking about where men's violence against women comes from, and starting off with the point that it is not an inevitable part of being men. That the way we construct ideas about manhood, the way we raise our sons, are ultimately the roots of where this violence comes from. And so while we look at the mighty falling and look at the rates of violence that we know around the world, we have data that tells us something about what are the factors that drive it, and I think helps us understand why it's not inevitable. Promundo is a research-focused organization that's been working on how do we transform masculinities in multiple spaces: schools, health sector, work in post-conflict settings with a number of partners here, Vital Voices, USIP, US State Department, and many of our NGO partners that are here. And a big piece of our work is about these drivers. So what I want to share with you is what this data is telling us about which men are using violence and how that data can help us inform programming and what we're learning from some of that programming. Since 2008, together with partners from the International Center for Research on Women, we put together a survey called Images, the International Men and Gender Equality Survey. It's now been carried out in more than 30 countries. And as you can see here, we have more than 60,000 interviews. This is sample survey research, women and men, in the countries in different shades there across the globe, asking men about their use of multiple forms of violence using the questions that the World Health Organization has designed, asking women about their experiences of it, and lots of other questions included in there. Men's childhood experiences, their caregiving, their health-related practices, self-harm, their attitudes about what it means to be men. It's a massive questionnaire. It's about as long as we can get men to sit still and answer a series of questions about their lives. Because we compare, never asking women and men in the same household, but in the same geographical settings for protection and for ethical concerns, we think we've got a good sense of, we at least feel confident that men are telling us something close to what they really carry out. What we find, not surprisingly, is that about a third to about half of men report they've ever used a form of physical violence against a female partner. And if we add to that forms of sexual violence, emotional, psychological, we get up to about 75%. But specifically looking at the use of men's violence against women in the home, then we can take that data and say, so which men? And some factors come out that are very consistent, whether it's low-income countries, middle-income countries, upper-income countries. And what are those? So sorry to break out before you've had coffee to break out odds ratios and some statistics in the morning, but it's pretty easy to follow. What it shows here is men who witness violence, experience it growing up, are the men who are far more likely to use it later on. So if you'll follow the orange one over here, witnessing violence, what that says is a man who witnesses in his home growing up, like Marcio did, sees his father or another man in the household use violence against his mother or another woman, he's got about 2.5 times more likelihood that he will use that violence later on in his relationship, unless something happens to break the cycle. That's not destiny, of course. We're not just products of everything we see. We have a huge role in breaking the cycle, and it doesn't let any man off the hook. But it does tell us a bit of where it comes from. If you're exposed to fights in schools and the community, so if you're around notions that violence is a normal thing for boys to do, and this is how men resolve conflicts, you're more likely to use violence in your intimate relationships as well. Put those two things together, and you get about 4 times the rate that if you are a witness or experience violence growing up, you will use violence against a female partner later on. Again, these are predictions. This is not demographic destiny. Just because you've seen it and lots of men speak out against it after they see it growing up. But these are the things that help construct it. Another key piece in the orange there are attitudes related to gender-based violence and attitudes about manhood. Not surprisingly, if you think a version of manhood is I've got to be tough, I've got to be strong, I've got to put her in her place, you're also more likely to use violence. Now, we'd like to think, looking at these, that these feel like, we've had the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. We've had laws in countries just about everywhere in the world. Haven't we made a dent in this? Surely the younger generation gets it. We would love to believe that. To test that question, last year, we carried out a study that we called the Man Box, that some of you may have seen, supported by Axe, the men's deodorant spray that's fortunately changed their ads from some kind of unfortunate James Bondy looking ones from the few years back to a much more updated one about what it means to be man and questioning that. We carried this out, random samples of 18 to 30-year-olds in 3 countries, the US, the UK, and Mexico, and affirmed that a very old school style of manhood is still very much alive and well. So here's a few of the stats. A guy who doesn't fight back when others push him around is weak, 67% in the US, 57% in Mexico, UK about in the middle. Guys should act strong even if they feel scared or nervous, 75% in the US, 65% in the UK, 60% in Mexico. On almost every question we asked, this version of a tough guy kind of manhood is very much alive and well, even as this is the generation that kind of gets that women are their equals. So sitting inside our sons is walking around this kind of dichotomous view of, I've got to show I'm tough, I can never let them see me sweat, I've got to be in charge all the time, and yet I think women are sort of also my equals, and what do I do? Not surprising, we also looked at if you believed in these, what we called the man box ideas, and your behaviors or your practices. On just about every negative behavior we looked at, if you were in the box, that if you believe these attitudes, you were more likely to do it. In fact, this slide could keep on going. This is not how I recommend you do slides with this much data, but I just showed it because everything we looked at was associated with whether men were in the box. So whether you had used violence, experienced violence, used online bullying, if you had perpetrated physical bullying, and this last one that matters a huge amount to us, if you had used sexual harassment, you were 3 to 6 times more likely to do it if you adhered to these items of this tough guy version of manhood. So the conclusion, and that was looking at other factors as well, education attainment, income levels, ethnicity, held up across the 3 countries. And there was really nothing different in the dynamics between Mexican men, British men, and young men here in the US. So the point is, we'd like to say this is some men somewhere over there. We'd like to say we're making some tremendous advances in this, but our data from last year, still quite fresh, still making noise from it, affirms quite a bit how much these young men, the young men that we're working with, hanging out with, our friends and family are still buying into these ideas. Now, if that's the violence begets violence side of the equation, what we see is a lot of data affirming what you just saw with Marcio in the film there, which is that we also see that if boys see growing up versions of caring manhood, they're more likely to gravitate toward versions of caring manhood. And the data also show that if you had a father or another man in the household who participated more equitably in household decisions, participated in the hands-on care of you and others in the household, you're 1.5 times more likely to do that than men who didn't see that. So if we have this equation that says, kind of obvious, we knew that violence begets violence, men's caregiving, men's participating in equitable ways in our relationship with others are seen every single day by our sons and daughters. The other side of this equation is that girls who have fathers or other men in the household who model this kind of equitable behavior have more equitable and autonomous and independence-affirming attitudes themselves. So these daily practices by men like Marcio are planting the seeds for the kind of empowered women we'd like to see our daughters become, and the kind of equitable, respectful sons that we'd like our sons to become. As we looked at some other analysis of the data, one of the key role of men standing up and being mediators between the violence that their sons often experience outside the home, and basically being part of an equation that says, you may see a lot of this out there, but that's not what manhood is about. So no matter where we've looked in high conflict, lower income, upper income countries, this equation of whether we model to our sons violent versions of manhood or equitable, caring versions of manhood seems to be one of the huge, kind of our big insight on what we need to do to think about engaging men in terms of ending these forms of violence. So what have we been doing? A few approaches that not only us, but many NGOs around the world building a field of practice around what seems to work with men and boys. We know a lot about what doesn't work, the one-off talks, that coach who comes in and for 20 minutes tells boys don't do it, the one-off ad, the one-off public service announcement, the simply say don't do it and hold men accountable matters a huge amount. It gets the conversation going, but in and of itself is not enough. So some of the things that we're finding in evidence work are these. One, work with young people to question these ideas about what it means to be men and women. If we can take these approaches into schools, we've been working now for nearly 20 years with an approach called Program H for hombres and homens in Spanish and Portuguese, and here in the US we call it Manhood 2.0. We've carried out 9 impact evaluations of this in other parts of the world, and currently with support from the CDC, we're doing 2 impact evaluations here in the US with this material. In schools and after-school programming, if you engage young people in critical reflections about these versions of manhood, we can see changes. Essentially, the activities focus on how's that version of manhood going for you? And we get men to take a look at how they've experienced the negative sides of these, how it has cut them off from the relationships they'd like to be part of, keeps them from seeking help they might need, has put them in a box in many ways, and they can see the self-harm and then talk about the harm that it does to others. That process is not always easy to get going, but we do find that this armor that we build around ourselves as this version of manhood, actually it doesn't take too long before we get guys to go, you know what, it really does cause harm, and I can see it and I can do something about it. And side by side, doing this work with young women, we include issues of homophobia and sexual orientation as part of that as well, and find that if we can get that taken to scale, we can start to make a difference. Another piece that we're building on is this huge field of women's economic empowerment. We certainly know how much women's access to income and employment, whether it's in cash transfers or microcredit or other forms, both helps households in general, helps women in terms of achieving the lives that they deserve and having the autonomy, including the autonomy to walk away from violent relationships, that when we engage men as partners in that, we can see both economic gains improve, as well as perhaps change dynamics at the household. We've been doing studies together with CARE and some other partners about this in different parts of the world, and find that rather than just treating men as kind of extraneous or bringers of harm in terms of women's economic empowerment, if we engage them in thoughtful ways in that programming, we can see the benefits get better. We've been partnering in Brazil. These 2 manuals shown there are part of combining this with Brazil's national cash transfer program called Bolsa Familia. So looking at ways that it's not just a handful of programs, but in fact that we can take this to scale and see larger benefits. A third, and I think you saw this hinted at in the film, is the issue of engaging men when they're fathers. We know that 80% of men in the world will be or are already biological fathers. The rest of men have lots of contacts with children in multiple ways or caring for others. This promotion of a caring version of manhood seems to be a fairly low-lying fruit in many ways. There is that moment, if you've ever spent any time in where prenatal visits are going on, or those of us who have been fathers, if we remember that deer in the headlights look when we find out that we're expecting a child, that we think we have to act, like we're kind of ready for this and all of that, but men are particularly open to hearing some ideas there. They're nervous. What does this mean? What is life going to be now? We take advantage of that deer in the headlights moment, and we're doing parent training in Rwanda and elsewhere. We've just done a randomized controlled trial with partners in Rwanda, and you can see the sample size there. Listening to women 9 months after the intervention, 16 weeks of parent training, fathers and some weeks with mothers, 50% less violence than before reported by women in the intervention group compared to no change in the control group. These are women's reports of violence that it reduced by 50%. For both parents, about a third reported less violence against children they already had, for those who had already had children. So we do believe that parent training makes sense. Other interventions being evaluated in different parts of the world, engaging parents in training in nonviolent child rearing and equitable relationships seems to work, and that is something we're working to scale up. We've looked at examples in Scandinavia where parent training is considered a national thing. You would be asked, hey, have you done your parent training? So this is going far beyond the kind of Lamaze stuff that we often do of being ready for childbirth to say thinking about what our relationships look like and how we advance on those. Fourth issue that has to be there is understanding the effects of trauma. Boys and girls who witness this violence growing up do experience a form of trauma. And we do have to understand it's not equal in terms of our chances or our likelihood as men of using violence later on. Making sense of the trauma that is experienced by witnessing this violence in the home needs to be part of our programming, even more so in countries at high risk of conflict or that have been through conflict. And we partner with USIP and others. We're doing some work in Lebanon, in DRC, and elsewhere, where the combination of conflict-related trauma as well as trauma of witnessing violence in the household are too often unaddressed. And then finally, how do we use the media and find other ways to change social norms? It's a huge responsibility, and I think that's something we can talk about as well, of thinking about the multiple ways that these ideas are repeated, laughed about. We're thrilled to have partnered with Axe that did change how their ads that once talked about manhood meets conquest to a version that said there is no single version of manhood. It is to be made up and reconstructed and thought about, and everybody will have their own version of it. Let's get out of that man box. So we do think the need for all of us to be part of that equation, governments, militaries, the media, those of us who work with youth and young people every day, those of you who have been doing work for years to empower women, how do we think about engaging men as part of this equation? The bottom line that we take from this is to affirm every single day that this violence is not inevitable. As we look at the mighty falling, as we look at tomorrow's headlines to say, this doesn't have to be part of our human history, or at least we can look back and say that was part of our human history. And I think to me, the big question of the moment is, will we look back at this Me Too moment kind of a year from now and kind of have scratched it off and we go back to life as normal? Or will we take this as a moment in our history in the US and elsewhere to say, we took some responsibility as men, we took a lot of responsibility as men on this, and that we're not going to deny it and say, not me, but that we're going to add our voices to what women have called our attention to in these last months. Thanks very much.
Good morning. I had my coffee. I don't know if everybody else did, but I had my coffee. Hi, my name is Kat Fotovat. I'm with the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, and I'm the program director. As we kick off this panel, I wanted to start off with just a couple of thank yous. First, thank you, this audience. This is amazing. What a wonderful turnout we had for this event. I want to thank all the civil society activists, all the NGOs, members of Congress, their staff. You guys should be so proud of yourself, and the press. This is so important to make sure that this issue is talked about. I also want to take some time and just make sure we thank our DRL and GUE colleagues, our J family, as well as our Deputy Secretary staff. And finally, this event would not have been at all possible without Doreen Milady. So I really want to take some time and thank her as well. So round of applause. All right, it is my honor and privilege to now introduce our moderator, Pam Pryor, the Senior Advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. After serving on both the Trump campaign and transition team, Pam was appointed to her position at the Department of State on January 20th, 2017. She covers a broad portfolio of justice, peace, and civilian security issues, including human trafficking, women's empowerment, religious freedom, and religious actor engagement, humanitarian assistance, and human rights. Quite a list. Throughout her career, Ms. Pryor has been a tireless advocate for human rights and religious freedom. As Chief of Staff to U.S. Representative J.C. Watts and Executive Director of House Republican Conference, she was a champion of the Faith-Based and Community Initiatives Bill that led to the creation of the White House Faith-Based Office and the agency Faith Centers government-wide. She's also been an absolute pleasure to work with and a tireless advocate for our issues. Thank you so much.
What a great panel, and we have a person who has just had knee surgery, and I am so impressed that he's walking at all. So we'll get him up here. Yay! Yeah, we need to talk about violence against knees sometime. That is, all you young people, you don't get that yet. You will, you will. I was just so taken, Gary, by your comments and the video. I'm a full-blooded Italian. I cry easily, and I was going, no, I have mascara on. Do not cry. And I was thinking about how really worldwide this has become a topic. I was just in Geneva last week at a UN meeting and got to meet a lot of colleagues, a lot of bilateral meetings, very interesting. There were gender-based violence workshops there. But I wanted to tell you all about just a specific conversation I had with our colleagues to the north and our friends in Canada. And I had given a statement, and I turned around, and the Canadians were giving their statement, half in French, half in English, as they have to do. And afterwards, I thought, you know what, it's time for me to have the talk with them. So I went over and I said, my name is Pam Pryor from the Department of State, United States of America, and we have a very serious immigration problem to discuss with you all. And the two gentlemen, one was about 40, one was about 60, they both leaned forward in their chairs. And he said, well, do we need to step aside? I said, no. I said, this is so important. We need to talk about it right now. He went, okay. And I finally said, will you do something about those geese and get them out of our country? I said, they are just going to the potty all over our lawns, our parks, everything. So anyway, we had a great laugh. And I thought it was good to start a topic like this that has got so much negativity in it. I happen to be a StrengthsFinders coach, and my number one characteristic is positivity. So aside from tossing my pen aside, I thought we need to kind of start this morning with a ha-ha, because what we're talking about is really serious. And these are issues that really do have a lot of impact on all of our lives. But what a panel we have. And I'm going to sit down. What I'm going to do is introduce each of them. You've already met Gary, so we're going to skip him. I'm going to introduce our panels, and then our panelists, and then we will go through just their presentations, and then actually do some questions. And I told them that if after a panelist talks, if they've got a comment, they're allowed to do this. We're not just going to have a panel full of little speeches. We are going to just actually talk about those Canadian geese, and if there's an issue, we're going to bring it up. So, okay, let me grab my pen. Hold on. Bending gracefully and getting back up with my knees. So Gary, thank you. We're going to skip you, like I said. Sure. So we've heard a little bit, although you've got an incredible background. Cindy Dyer is next. Cindy is the Vice President of Vital Voices Human Rights Team, and she oversees all the programming and partnerships related to domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, and harmful cultural practices. Before joining Vital Voices in 2008, Cindy served as the Director of the United States Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. She's a specialized domestic and sexual violence prosecutor for 13 years and served for 10 years as a member of a public policy committee for the Texas Council on Family Violence. And you will detect that she is from Texas. And we like that about her. Nate Galbraith is next. He's the Deputy Director at the Department of Defense. Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office. In this position, he is the department's expert for prevention and response programs and the relationship to behavioral health, forensic science, criminal investigation, sex offender assessment and treatment. Dr. Galbraith previously served as the department's highly qualified, how do you like that? Expert on sexual assault prevention and response, and is an expert in forensic science and clinical psychology. He maintains close ties to the law enforcement community and teaches forensic science, child abuse, and sexual assault investigations. Woo, isn't it weird people actually do that for a living? That is something. That's a big bunch of stuff you do there. And Tina Ramirez, long-term friend of mine. She is the founder and president of Hardwire. She spent the past 10 years defending oppressed communities in more than 30 countries. She served as a policy researcher for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, as a foreign policy advisor for various members of the U.S. Congress. I which is where I first met Tina, serving in Congress. And she helped found and direct the bipartisan Congressional International Religious Freedom Conference. And finally, to her left is Ambassador Steve Steiner. He's the gender advisor for the U.S. Institute of Peace. When Gary was talking about USIP, it's the U.S. Institute of Peace. He previously served in the Department of State's Office of Global Women's Issues and the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking. He served 36 years in the United States Foreign Service with tours of duty at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and the State Department's offices, Soviet Union, West German Affairs, and from 83 to 88, he served as the defense programs on the National Security Council staff. He was also named by President Reagan as the U.S. representative to the Special Verification Commission, which is the implementing body for the Intermediate Range of Nuclear Forces Treaties. You know, the one thing I've learned from the State Department since I've been here, everybody does really important things here. And it's just such a pleasure to have you. Gary, we'll come back to you since you had a little bit of time before the rest of us. Cindy, we would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I'm being projected.
It's
and
a
I'm
little
not
tiny.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be on a panel with these amazing folks, so thank you so much for the opportunity. At Vital Voices, we work with women leaders to help them unleash their potential to change their communities. We work in 3 major areas. One is economic empowerment by working with business women. The other is political participation, encouraging women to run for office. And then the third is in human rights, where we are working with women leaders who are working to end all forms of violence against women and girls in their communities. I obviously run the human rights program there, and we try to have a very comprehensive approach to ending violence against women and girls. We work with women leaders to both change the law to make sure that the law accurately addresses these issues, making sure it is against the law to be violent to women and girls, but also working to make sure that there are protective orders available and other sorts of legal frameworks. We recognize that laws alone will not keep women safe, especially when after we pass them, we don't do anything except sit back and admire them. That doesn't work very well. So we also work with women leaders to make sure that those laws are implemented and that they're implemented in a way that holds the defendants accountable, but that also protects the safety and dignity of the victims. In addition to working on legal frameworks, we make sure that comprehensive services are available for survivors. We have a number of programs that increase the access to services for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. But we also recognize that in addition to providing services, we need to make sure that our women leaders have partners in the community. And one of the main partners that they need are male leaders to stand with them and support them. A lot of the work that we do is done through a large public-private partnership that we are fortunate to have with Vital Voices, the Department of State, specifically the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and also the Global Women's Issues Office. And we have brought in some private partners to this work to make sure that this is truly a public and private effort. We're fortunate to have the support of the Avon Foundation for Women and also other organizations, including Hilton Worldwide. Through that partnership, we are able to accomplish many of those goals. We have an urgent assistance program that provides immediate, urgent financial assistance to survivors of extreme forms of gender-based violence all around the world. These are people that would not otherwise have access to medical care or legal assistance or shelter. In addition to the urgent assistance, we have a technical assistance program supported by the Avon Foundation that allows us to go. We've trained more than 1,000 community leaders to help them develop a coordinated response to both prevent and respond to violence against women. And a lot, certainly we know that there are high rates of femicide that are occurring. We absolutely do help our communities that we're working in prosecute those cases of murder and extreme violence, but even more importantly, we help them prevent those cases of murder and extreme violence by aggressively intervening in violence before it becomes that bad. We also are working to create an international network of violence against women service providers. So it's been a real pleasure to get to work on this large public-private partnership, and it's a pleasure to be here today.
Thanks, Cindy. We're going to go over to the Department of Defense, so if you just want to hand your mic there. Nate, I know that it's interesting, you've got the majority of people in your employ are men, although we have men and women in our armed forces now. But you're going to talk specifically about what DOD is doing, right?
Absolutely. Don't know if you all know or not, but about 2004, we received a lot of reports coming from Afghanistan and Iraq about people experiencing, our active duty folks experiencing sexual assault and not having a lot of help and places to turn. At that time, Secretary Rumsfeld put together a joint task force because that's how we do things in the department, anywhere else, right? You have to have a task force. But put together a task force to take a look at how we handle the problem of sexual assault in the military. At the time, we all had all the different services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, all had services and support for victims that came forward, but what we didn't have was a single point of contact that people could go to kind of usher you through the system and tell you what your options are, what the services were that you could have. And so at that time, in 2005, we stood up this office and we put together a policy that fundamentally changed how the Department of Defense approaches sexual assault in the military. And since that time, we've put sexual assault response coordinators and victim advocates at every single base throughout the world. We relied on our friends at the American Prosecutors Research Institute, APRI, to help give us some advice. Matter of fact, they even give us a person to help us, Teresa Scalzo, to help us put together this. And I showed up in the office about 2007, and it was very, very difficult in putting this kind of change together in a 1.3 million person active duty force. If you add our reservists in, then we're over 2 million people. And of course, we're distributed throughout the world. And while it's very important that in the world when we go out, we are often the first ambassadors that people see in their country from the United States. And when that happens, you cannot be good ambassadors until you have this problem of gender-based violence cleaned up in your own house. And as a result, we've worked very, very hard to help everybody understand that being a warrior means that you might be called to do some very aggressive things, but that does not mean that that's how you act out usually towards people in your own, within your own organization or outwardly towards our host nation counterparts. And learning how to incorporate that idea of what does a real warrior mean, what does men and masculinities, all that kind of thing, focuses very, very hard on what does dignity and respect look like throughout a force. And we try to help everybody understand that when we go to prevention and response of this problem within the DoD, we work very, very hard to help everybody understand that this is part of our core values. This is who we are, to prevent and to support people that come forward and want to report a sexual assault. We've had some progress. If we have some time, I'll show you a little bit of that progress as we go on. But since that time, in addition to the sexual assault response coordinators everywhere, we've changed how we invite people to report sexual assault with unrestricted reporting, which is business as usual participation in the justice process, or through restricted reporting, which is just basically a confidential report to certain parties in the DoD that allows you to keep your report confidential and you don't have to participate in the justice system. We found that that has actually increased our reporting by about a quarter. And that is, and in addition to that, allows us to see more of the problem, allows us access to go after and hold people appropriately accountable as a result of that greater reporting. In addition to that, we've also provided victims, and this is something that you won't see anywhere else in the country, their own victim, their own special victims counsel to support them and to represent them as they go through the justice system. And so that's been a very, very popular program, and a lot of our folks that have made a report of sexual assault have found that having their own attorney with whom they have privilege and confidentiality to help them through that the justice process has been very, very effective. So a lot of other things that we've done, but I'll go ahead and I'll stop there and pass it on.
Great, thank you. And I think Tina's got...
I think it works, yeah.
Yay,
Thanks.
yay. And Tina, I was just thinking about, I know you're going to come from a faith-based perspective, which most, I know the Abrahamic faiths especially, but, many of us grew up with the golden rule, which was do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then also hearing the most important commandment outside of your relationship to a creator, if you choose to believe that, is to love one another. And I know those are things that have been important to you, and you've been actually in the field working on those issues. So tell us about what you're doing there.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. And I guess just a little bit more background. I started out as a teacher out in California, so my background is really in education, although I was kind of launched into policy, which all of you have the joy of doing every day. I'm glad to be out of it. I like to be an educator. It's a little bit more fun. I get to work with kids. And then earlier this year, we just concluded the 3rd edition of an encyclopedia of human rights in the United States. Part of that does include a chapter on women, but my focus over the last 15, 16 years has specifically been on the human right to freedom of religion or belief. And how does that, obviously religion and belief as a faith-based issue relate to the topic today, and that's what I want to share with you, is how education in the concept of freedom of religion or belief is actually opening doors to conversations about gender-based violence, violent extremism, helping children in particular, but also civil society leaders begin to respect more deeply the inherent human dignity of others. At Hardwired, we're an organization that provides education and training around the world to leaders in countries that are experiencing religion-related conflict, and the whole purpose of it is to establish local leadership that can advance not only the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief as an international human right, but inherent human dignity. And Hardwired is, like you, we all believe that we're hardwired for freedom, right? That's why we're here, and that's the name of the organization and what we do. So for the last few years, after leaving Congress, I felt that one of the things that was missing in the space was a lack of leadership in countries where there was religion-related conflict to actually advance local rights for people themselves. So often, as an international advocate, we can help people, but really the importance is how do you establish that local leadership so that we can break those cycles of violence and extremism within the communities themselves. And so we work in many countries, Asia, Americas, but in particular what I want to share about is our work in Iraq. As many of you know, the situation in Iraq is pretty horrific, and especially as it relates to the rights of women. I was there a few years ago when just weeks after the genocide started, meeting with Yazidi communities that had been displaced. These were communities that I had taught a course on women's rights to at the University of Doha just a few years prior. So they were people that I knew personally, and then seeing them displaced, hearing their stories, seeing the fractured families, seeing the poverty, seeing the trauma, seeing just the loss of loved ones, of men that had been shot and killed and put in mass graves, of 6,000 girls that had been sexually enslaved, and even hearing the stories of those that had escaped was horrifying. And I thought, well, what can we do? So for the last few years, what Hardwired has done is we've worked with establishing civil society leadership there to advance the rights of everyone, regardless of what religion or belief you have, which was essential in a community that had just been attacked by a group based on religious extremism that said, we're going to kill everyone, regardless of who you are, what you believe, unless you accept our orthodoxy, even dissenters from within their own community. So this was a really horrifying situation, and people didn't know how to respond to it. So we established some local leadership. But the second thing that we did that we thought was really important was to work with children, with teachers and children, because one of the things in Pramunda's report that is a well-known statistic, is that children who have seen violence will beget violence. It's very common. I mean, it's hard to break out of that cycle. And there are the people that break the mold, as Pramunda's report describes, but it's very difficult. And what we saw as we began working with teachers in Iraq were situations where children would be on the playground and the teacher reported to us that they would see kids playing games where they were beheading one another. Now, they could just as easily be having a slave market of women and pretending to do that. And this isn't just one story. We've heard it over and over again, not just in Iraq, but in Morocco and Lebanon and other countries where we work. Children have seen things, and they are identifying with it, with the group in power, and beginning to act it out. It's very real. And so how do you take a country where 6,000 girls have just been sexually enslaved, where 600,000 children living in Mosul have just witnessed girls not being able to go to school, sexual violence, mistreatment of women, the most horrific things possible, markets of women. How do you help children in that environment that that's what they've seen? Because that's what they will identify with unless you do something to break that. It's not that the children want to believe those things because of their religion or any other thing. These are kids, they could be minority, people from minority faiths. It could be people of no faith. It's that children identify with that and they will repeat that cycle. And so what Hardwired uses in our trainings is a process called conceptual change. And it sounds very similar to a lot of the methods that I saw shared in the video with Pramundo. But conceptual change is a theory developed by Piaget, and it was used mostly in science work. It's very rarely been used in the social sciences, but we've applied it into the human rights field to take people through a very rigorous educational training where we literally break down the way that they process information and help them restart, basically reprogram how they see something. Because it's easy to go and to share human rights, and we actually have little booklets that we shared with all the Yazidi girls that had escaped from ISIS about what are your rights, so that for the first time they could hear, I have value, I have dignity, I have rights. But that's not enough, because you have to instigate conceptual change in the way people process information in order to break that cycle. Otherwise, they'll continue to see it. Children don't know how to respond. Teachers don't know how to respond to what they're seeing. And so what we've done is we've worked with teachers to go through a process of conceptual change about their view of the rights of others themselves, breaking down the fears, misconceptions, beliefs, attitudes that they have about the rights of others. And then they are able to develop lessons that then help children go through that process. And so what we've seen then in Iraq, and we have data from about 3,000 students, so a pretty good sample size throughout the Middle East in 3 different countries, including Iraq, to show that there is a significant positive change in pre and post attitudes about women and gender based on this education and process of conceptual change about freedom of religion or belief and the rights and freedoms of others. Now, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief opens the door to those conversations, because there's a lot of hard conversations that have to be had in these countries in contexts about women that relate to religion or traditional values that are often taboo conversations. And by really addressing one of the hardest conversations, which is religion, it opens the door to that. And so I can share more in the remarks later, but I don't want to take up all the time. I just want to share that, in conclusion, that I wanted to share how religion and the education and the freedom of religion or belief is really opening the doors to conversations about many of the issues affecting gender-based violence and extremism in a region of the world where there is a major problem with it. And that, in the Pramundo report that was on the 3 countries, we actually work in 2 of those 3 countries, and that we're seeing actual shifts in attitudes and behavior based on this. And just as one example, a teacher in a mixed religion classroom in a refugee camp, some of the Muslim families came to him and said, we wanted to segregate the families by religion. And he, after the training, was able to say, look, that's just what ISIS is doing. And we don't want, we need to have a place where boys and girls are together, because what the research shows is that when boys and girls are in mixed classrooms together, it actually creates more dissonance about their views of the rights of others, and actually creates that conceptual change that is going to lead them to a place where they can challenge the intolerant ideas that got them all put in the refugee camp in the first place. And the families understood after they worked through it, and it was very exciting. It was a positive conclusion, but they didn't have that knowledge to do that beforehand. So that's what we do, and the work that we're seeing in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Okay, Steve, you want to wrap up for us on this part of the panel? Tell us what's going on over at the U.S. Institute for Peace.
Thanks, Pam. It's a great pleasure to be back here. I've spent about 150 years working with the State Department, roughly. I'm particularly grateful to Doreen for all your work in organizing this, and it's so nice to be working with DRL again and with GWE. As you know, I'm a graduate of GWE as well as the Foreign Service, and my last year and a half at State were with the Office of Global Women's Issues, so I remain in close contact and consider myself a big friend of your office and of DRL as well. The last several years of my Foreign Service career were involved with nuclear arms negotiations, as you said, Pam. And when I got into women's rights later, I was often asked, how can you go from hard security issues to soft security issues? But I don't buy those terms. I think women's rights are very much a security issue. I think it was useful that the famous resolution in 2000, UNSC 1325, is called Women, Peace, and Security, because one of the big challenges, as many of you know, Matt, there is getting men engaged in this work. And having that S word there did help. You know, starting to tell men that this is a security issue, it affects the security of your country and your region, particularly if there's an abuse of women's rights, and you need to get involved. In my second career, which was post-Foreign Service, I spent another 7.5 years at State, which was capped off by the time in GWE. But I first went to the old G front office, Global Affairs, and started working on democracy and human rights issues, and that led me quickly to women's rights. I worked on shaping the Millennium Challenge account, also on the Community of Democracies, and I quickly saw that you just can't succeed in any of this unless women are empowered, particularly in countries that have gone through violent conflict. And I always like to quote Condi Rice, Secretary of State then, who said, half a democracy is not a democracy, because that's exactly right. That's just pretending if you're not empowering half your population, and particularly the female half. When I went to USIP, and it's about 7 years now, or getting there, one of the first things I did was a Lessons Learned Best Practices project, and we published something on this, on what are the best ways for us to work together in the international community to find the best kind of programs to empower women in countries that have gone through terrible violent conflict. And of course, one of our conclusions, I sometimes like to say, was that particularly in these countries, particularly in South Asia and the Middle East, much, much more has to be done to reach out and engage men and to get them interested and supportive of the efforts to empower women. A second thing, this helped to lead to our trying to find ways to take action in this area. And our action was also formed in part by a forum at SAIS in February of 2013, which was called Conflict Resolution and Prevention Forum. And this one was focused on how to engage men to support women's rights, because the theme there was that they think that in all these efforts to focus on women's leadership, questions of masculinities, and that's a plural, in conflict were basically being ignored, and they felt that correctly, masculinities in conflict can have an awful lot to do with the dynamics of a particular conflict and with finding ways to resolve it, to get reconciliation among hostile forces, and to build peace. That was one of our first efforts to look at opportunities to engage men. And at that forum, Kathleen Keenest, who's the director of our gender programs at USIP, promised the audience, which included Promundo as a partner and the World Bank as a partner, that same year, in the fall of 2013, we would have a major symposium called Men, Peace, and Security. And by God, we pulled it off, and we did it in late October of 2013. And we call this Men, Peace, and Security because we see this as the indispensable other side of the UNSC 1325 coin, in that any of these countries aren't going to get there on 1325. They're not going to get there on the required national action plan unless they have a very concerted, organized effort to reach out and engage men to understand and support women's rights. And at our symposium, we had over 200 participants, 55% were men. We made a big effort to get men. Promundo was a partner and was very helpful in this effort. And I saw, to my pleasant surprise, that there was already quite a network around the world, particularly in the Global South, of men who are practitioners in this field and who are working on, trying to get a narrative of peaceful masculinity accepted among young men and boys in their countries. I was particularly impressed with a network in the Balkans, and my very first beloved little foreign service post was Zagreb, so in the old Yugoslavia. So this is close to my heart. And there's a network in the 7 countries that now are the old Yugoslavia, 7 countries. Talk about balkanization, huh? There's a network there of NGOs run by young men that work with young men in their countries to get them to accept a peaceful sense of their own masculinity, to respect girls and women, to combat gender-based violence, and to recognize and combat all kinds of hate speech, which includes hate speech against other religious and ethnic groups, which has been a horrible thing in the Balkans, and also hate speech against girls and women. And believe it or not, when a couple of years ago I was back in my beloved Zagreb and met with some of the activists who work on these issues there, they said there still is a lot of hate speech. Of course, there's hate speech there against Serbs and others, but there's still a lot of hate speech in Croatia against girls and women. So if you find it there, you're going to find it in a lot of other places there. And the final thing I wanted to mention was we have a program still ongoing in Afghanistan, working with young men there, young men ages 18 to 35. Promundo has been our international trainer for this, and we're trying to get them to accept a narrative of peaceful masculinity. It's not getting the guys in a room in a violent country like Afghanistan and saying, hey, let's think about gender equality. It's getting them in a room and saying, let's think about the good you can do as a peace builder in your family, your community, and in your sadly violent country. And this has worked well. We did some practice sessions. We were warned about possible spoilers coming into the room and disrupting things, but knock on wood, it's gone well. We've trained about 130, 140 men. We did a training of trainers for about 20 to 30 of the best. And we're now also in a public advocacy phase, trying to get more public acceptance of peaceful masculinity and that what men can do as peace builders. So that's been a hard challenge, but it works, and I think it shows that you can take on such a program and challenge certain cultural norms, like the norms in Afghanistan have become very much associated with men, showing how tough they have to be, showing that they're violent. Many of them have been affected by terrible violence, and we wanted to get them to open up and show what violence has done to them and their families and what could be done about turning around lives of themselves and others. And interestingly, one last point, in that context, particularly under advice from my Afghan-American female colleagues, it was decided no women in the room for any of those sessions because we had a diverse group of men, young men. We wanted to build trust among them. We wanted them to get to open up about violence. That's not easy. And having women in there from that culture would have changed the dialogue and made it even harder to get them to open up. So this program is ongoing and it's been successful. It's only a pilot in 4 provinces. We'd love to find a way to get to more of that country and Iraq and others. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Gary, let's come back to you. You've heard everybody here. I was kind of interested, I'm sure it's a matter of grant making, but is there a reason you weren't in the Middle East? Because that's where we're so aware right now of this violence. And is that on the agenda for you? Or just talk to us a little bit about where you've been and how you got there. How'd you choose those countries?
Yep. The countries where we work has been a combination. We started off as an organization in Brazil, looking at voices of nonviolent men and building on those, so kind of questioning this equation that manhood is equal to violence and saying, even in the most violent settings, there are many men whose lives have been harmed, who are ready to become allies and saying, that's not the version of manhood I believe in or want to be part of. So our work started in Brazil. We partner a lot in Latin America. We have an office now in DRC, working particularly in the context of settings where 1/4 of women experienced rape during the conflict, their life shattered by that, and where men often react, well, both being perpetrators but also having carried out violence against their wives after that, and so finding ways that we support. So Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, we have just finished a 4-country study supported in part by Vital Voices and some support from Global Women's at State, looking at what's up with men in the Middle East that we launched in May of this year in Beirut, using that data to begin some work, particularly in Lebanon with a group called Abad, engaging religious leaders, working with young men to be voices against violence, and also doing work with the media to come up with different narratives about the violence as well. And you brought up, and if I can turn a question back, since you said we could provoke as well, is to push an issue of, as we think about that thing called funding, I think it's a really important moment to ask this question. Is we're having this session right now in UK Parliament at the moment. There's an event going on called What Works in Violence Prevention. The Brits have put about £35 million in impact evaluation of gender-based violence prevention, with an argument that we can fix this. We can come up with some solutions that work, we can evaluate them. We're not done, but there is an unprecedented, they started this I think about 4 years ago, and I'm saying this deliberately to provoke us on this side of the shores, to say they've put this amount of money over the last 5 years to look at what works in gender-based violence prevention. We've got more data than we've ever had before on what works to prevent it in the Middle East and elsewhere. Still we need to do more. But I think this is in the U.S. State Department. Many of you have contacts with those who vote. As we think about IVAWA, the International Violence Against Women Act, as we think about other approaches we've had in this city, I think we've got the incumbent question to ask and say, if we're serious about prevention and we've got evidence on what works, and we just heard from Steve and from Hardwired and others of what works in DOD, we know in large part what works on this. And I think the question we've got to ask, and so you brought it up, that's why I got to bring up funding, that we've got to ask ourselves, are we as a country committed to ending this violence? Because if so, we've got to put the appropriate resources behind it. So I think that is the question that to me has to be brought up today. So
Well,
thank you for touching on it.
Thank goodness the Deputy Secretary will be here, and you can ask him that directly. Just go right into that. Yeah, and I think, you raise a good point. I often say, as long as people are having their heads chopped off, we need to prioritize things. Maybe there's other things that we've done that aren't quite as important until we get some peace some places. So I think we need to watch where we're putting those tourniquets and not just doing, just a smattering of things when we can. Okay. So, yeah, if you had unlimited money, what would you do? Only kidding. Don't even go there yet, okay? No. You want Yeah, because, there are, obviously, and the studies that you've done, I know those are not cheap, having done focus groups in the past. Those are some things. But, Cindy, tell us about what have you guys done? I've heard a lot that you're just getting men to talk, which is sometimes difficult, although I always tell girls, if you really want to, figure out what to do, just ask guys about themselves. There's that old joke, yeah, enough about me. What do you think about me? Is that violent? Did I just promote a stereotype? Oops. But the fact that you're getting people to talk, which is something that doesn't cost a ton of money. How basic, right? Just the minute we start conversation. I love what C.S. Lewis said, the beginning of friendship is when you say, wow, I didn't think you thought the same thing that I did on that. So there is some stuff that you've all been doing on that. And Cindy, tell us what you found that worked.
Well, one of the things that we have found, and it's really piggybacking on something that Gary had said earlier about that the majority of men are nonviolent. But what we know is that just being nonviolent is insufficient. We need men to not only be nonviolent, but also to demand nonviolence in their brethren, in their brothers and their fathers and their friends. And so I think a lot of men say, I want to be an ally. I want to be an ally, but I don't know what to do. What is it that I need to do? And I know that I think that we need to find opportunities for our male nonviolent partners to be champions. And so that's one of the things that we do at Vital Voices, because people say, well, you're at a women's leadership organization. What do you have to do with male leaders? Well, let me tell you, folks, that my women leaders say, I need, starts with an F, funding. I need funding, and I need visibility, I need training. But also I need men to stand with me. And so we at Vital Voices try to provide these opportunities for men to be champions. One example is through our Justice Institutes, where we go into a community and we really transform the way a community prevents and responds to gender-based violence. Now, we're working with a woman leader as we go into this community, and we tell her who is a good guy. Who is a good guy in your community? What relationship would you like to foster? And so we let her kind of pick who is going to be a good person to work with me on this. And then we develop this relationship. And my mother used to always say, never let an opportunity to give a compliment pass you by. So when we have a male champion who comes in and says, I'll do this with you, I will speak on this, I'll help get the police department into the room, we want to be sure that we follow my mother's rule and we compliment. And we say, we want to give them visibility and credibility. And it's so ironic that just tonight, Vital Voices has our Voices of Solidarity Awards, and we are giving awards to, I think this year, 5 amazing men. Now, it just so happens that as one of our prior honorees is to my right. And so we want to, this is in keeping with that, when men do come and really, it's a big risk for them sometimes. Maybe it's stepping out of their role as a CEO. We want to be sure that we give them the proper credit, because then that encourages other men to come and work with us. And when men do come to our Justice Institutes that we do as a partnership with the State Department, that male voice in the room speaks really loudly to the male participants as well as the female participants. And so I think that what we do is give them an opportunity to be involved and give them a specific role and then foster that relationship.
Thank you. And I do want to say, both Gary and Cindy, I appreciated you saying, because you're right, with the conversation right now, there is a tendency for us to think that all men are fill in the blank, all women are fill in the blank. And we are all fearfully and wonderfully made. There's no one that's to be thrown away. And I so believe in redemption, so I appreciate what you're doing. Tell me, over there at the Department of Defense, are you making headway? We don't hear as much as we did for a while. I don't know if that's because, as Gary said, other things have pushed it off the headlines. But tell me, are you all feeling that you are making some headway there is success there?
We are, and it's after 10 years of focus, what I can tell you is that we had to learn a little bit about how do you track sexual assault? How do you track progress? And data is huge. We have to know what our population thinks and does, and we have to be able to listen to them and hear about them regularly. So if I were to just sum it up in a couple of quick points, as you know, sexual assault is a underreported crime. That in the United States, only about 15% of the sexual assaults that ever occur come forward. And when we say sexual assault in the military, or a lot of times there are a lot of different definitions, but our definition is anything, whether it's a penetrating crime like rape, or it's a sexual contact crime like a groping or things along those lines. So we talk about the full spectrum of unwanted sexual behaviors between individuals. One of the things that we didn't know when we first started off in 2004, we were only receiving about 1,600 reports of sexual assault each year. If you think about it, in a population of about 1.3 million people, that's not a whole heck of a lot. But you don't know whether that's good or that's bad. You don't know whether, reports sometimes could indicate to you whether or not you have a crime problem, or sometimes they can indicate to you whether or not people feel comfortable coming forward to get help and assistance. But we didn't have that data when we started out. We just knew that, okay, 1,600 reports, is that a lot or not? So one of the things that we did in about 2007 is we started looking at our prevalent surveys of the active duty force. They'd only been done a couple of times at that point, but in 2006 we had a survey that had been done, and my office didn't know about it, and so we actually found it and we went, oh wow, so at least somebody asked the question, right? Because we knew that when those 1,600 or so reports was just a small tip of the iceberg as far as what happened. And so in 2006, we estimated that we got about 34,000 active duty members had experienced sexual assault in the past year. It's a big number. What's even more shocking, though, is the proportion of men and women in that number. Of the 34,000, 14,000 were women victims, 20,000 were male victims. And so we began to realize very quickly sexual assault in the military is not necessarily a one gender on another. It is equal. It's equal as far as the risk to both. And the reason why we know that number works out that way is even though women are at greater risk for sexual assault in the military with higher prevalence rates of victimization, we're 85% male. And so very small percentages of men turns out to be a very big number. So if you want to do the math is about, that year was about 6.8% of women and 1.8% of men in the past year experienced sexual assault. And so that's about 34,000. Now, 10 years later, this last year in 2016, our prevalence rates are down by 2/3 for men and down by 1/3 for women. And so this year our number is about 14,900. And for the first time, we actually have fewer male victims than we did female victims. And so it's about 8,600 women and about 6,300 men. And so what works? With regard to this, we knew that we also had to increase reporting because we had to know how often we needed to hear from people and increase the number of people that were coming forward. And in 2006, only about 7% of military victims came forward and reported the crime. But this last year in 2016, about 1 in 3, about 33% of folks came forward. So our reporting has increased substantially, and we're working very, very hard. So we have two goals in the military. We actually want the prevalence or the past year occurrence of sexual assault to decrease. But we encourage more and more reporting of sexual assault. In the press, you often hear, oh, reports are up, it's a bad news story. And you said, well, not necessarily. When in times of decreasing prevalence or occurrence of sexual assault, increasing reporting means something entirely different. It means that people are more confident coming forward. They're going to use the services that we put out for them. And so we see that as progress. So what works? What brought us there? The challenge is in the military, we're very hierarchical. We respect our senior leaders, and it wasn't really until our senior leaders began speaking about this as a very important thing. Mr. Secretary of Defense Panetta was one of the first people that started very, very publicly talking about, hey, we have a problem, it's sexual assault, and we're going to get after that. And ever since, every single Secretary of Defense, including this one, has done a number of different things in this arena to bring things forward. Secretary Mattis this last year, we've had a lot of progress within the DoD as a whole across all 4 services, but one of the challenges that we have are the military service academies. And so Secretary Mattis brought the superintendents of the service academies forward along with the service chiefs this last March, and brought them all around a table and said, guys, got to fix this. And excuse me, guys and girl, because we had Lieutenant General Johnson from the Air Force Academy, who was our female superintendent. And we got to get after this. We got to fix this. And so right now, the service academies are working on revitalized plans to kind of get after this. Bystander intervention, in other words, the chance to be heroes and look out for your fellow person, has figured very, very prominently in what we do, and to encourage people to do that. But one of the things, one of the themes that I heard across everybody's thing is making it real for the individual. That if it's not, you can talk about bystander intervention and you can say, you can teach people, you can distract, or you can delegate, or you can do a number of things to kind of get a person out of that situation. But that's very difficult for people. And unless you make it real and you help them find what their line is, they might not necessarily intervene. So you're not necessarily teaching that. So a lot of our focus now for the future is making that bystander intervention more relevant, giving the senior leaders the voice track, the education, the training that they need in order to bring their people, help their people
I was going to ask you, are you doing training? Are you?
Oh, yes, yes.
Intentional training?
Lots and lots of training. As a matter of fact, people are kind of, our program is called the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program, or SAPR, and people are kind of sappered out. But but because they hear this all the time. When I go and I teach the leaders, I was just down at the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute in Cocoa Beach, Florida last week, teaching some senior leaders. These are colonels and majors and Navy captains and senior civilian and senior enlisted folks. And I get up in front and said, we're going to talk a little bit about sexual assault. And I said, raise your hand if you haven't had any training in the past year. And nobody raises their hand. But at the end of the drill, what I would tell you is that everybody gets it. But now our next foray, the next thing, and very, very conveniently given the national conversation that we're having, is that connection of sexual harassment to sexual assault as a possibility for prevention of sexual assault. In the military, if you're a woman and you've been sexually harassed in the past year, you're also 15 times more likely to have experienced sexual assault. If you're a man and you've been sexually harassed in the past year, you're 43 times more likely to have experienced sexual assault in the past year as well. This is where we're going. And men often experience sexual assault in the form of hazing and bullying. It's much different. And it often during duty hours and their duty sections, as opposed to like in an acquaintance situation or when you're out with friends or something like that downtown at a bar. A lot of our male sexual assault doesn't involve alcohol. So it's a really, really different approach to maybe what people traditionally think about prevention.
Thank you for that. Tina, as a person that doesn't get a ton of State Department funding on stage, what success? Have you come away from a program where you've gone, oh, this is so gratifying. I think we can make some headway here.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think we do receive a lot of funding from the United Kingdom. So the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is a huge supporter of the work that we do to counter violent extremism in the world through forward-based education. And the reason that they do it is because they're very concerned about how do you build resiliency in communities where extremism is contributing to so many other human rights abuses, conflict, humanitarian crises, refugee crises, so much else. And what we found, we did a pilot with the British government in 3 countries, included Israel, Dubai, or UAE, and Iraq. Actually, in Morocco, there's 4 countries. And in that pilot, we found that teachers that we worked with were able to develop lessons and really begin to see a change in their students' behaviors, so that we then expanded it into formal programs in 3 countries that we got government support from. So we worked with officials in Morocco, Lebanon, and in Iraq to establish a formal program where we worked with a core group of teachers to train them in freedom of religion or belief and in developing lessons that they could utilize in the classrooms. That's where we now have a sample of about 3,000 students that have been through the program about twice now. And the data that we're seeing from that is showing a statistical significance in building resiliency against violence and violent attitudes, which is obviously related to gender-based violence, but many other things that these children are seeing in those countries. As well as opening the door to more positive attitudes towards the rights of women, minority groups, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and others. And so what we're seeing is a shift that by facilitating these difficult conversations around religion, conscience, belief, we can begin to address a lot of the difficult conversations about traditional values or issues that or other conflict that the children are seeing that they don't know how to process. And it's leading them to the ultimate goal, which is to value the inherent rights and dignity of others more. It's not about teaching them religion or, that's not the point. The point is, how do you build resiliency in communities and help them value the inherent human rights and dignity of others so that there's a more equal playing field for everyone? And that's what we're seeing. And because we're seeing that in this data, and it's pretty strong, we actually have officials from Saudi Arabia and Jordan that are interested in this work, which is fascinating because never in the region have you had any of the countries really interested in this area of human rights, let alone the Saudis. So we will see what happens with it, but there's a lot of room for growth with it. And the Kurdish government, which is sadly in challenging time right now, has also invited us to work with all of the students in their region. So it's about 1.8 million kids that they want to have go through these lessons because they see the impact it can have on really building resiliency and helping these children process what they've witnessed and seen and been experienced trauma from, either directly or indirectly. They recognize that the Yazidi community in the North and the trauma that has affected these poor girls and families, and all of the other minority communities that have been displaced and everyone else, that there's a lot to process. And so we use some of the best practices for trauma victims in the methods that we use in our educational program. And so it's an indirect method that helps, almost like play therapy, children work through the trauma in a way that releases that negative things that they've seen and replace it with something positive. And so communities, not just the children, but the entire communities are beginning to work together in ways in villages that we've seen in Sinjar or in Mosul or Nineveh that are remarkable for what they've been through. And so because of that, we're really excited to be expanding it across the country, and we'll come back and share more about that another time.
Good, and then we'll have the data from Gary's work as well. And the next thing, we've got just a couple minutes, 3 minutes. Okay, I was going to say, Steve, and I'd kind of pose this to all of you. I know, Steve, you talked about a lot of conferences you were doing, but is there a myth that continues to need to be busted? There's a myth buster. Is there anything that we just need to go, no, we have to quit thinking that way? Is there, as you're looking at the kind of, say, as a prosecutor, Cindy, as a statistician, Gary, in the DOD and your work over there, is there something that we need to kind of just focus on, or is there a myth that we need to dispel?
Well, I would put this in a positive way, because I think these comments here, particularly the last few minutes, show that we've already busted quite a few myths. That not all men are perpetrators, that men can be victims, that women can be
And Gary,
perpetrators
you were so kind
of violence.
to say that too. Yeah.
Women can be perpetrators of violence. ISIS is a good example of what the terrible things that some women have done there. I think another good thing is there is much more recognition now of the importance of women's empowerment, and there's much more recognition of the need to engage men. I can't tell you how many meetings I went to in this building when it was 40 to 1, 50 to 1. Now, as the only man, we'd have interesting women leaders from around the world, but we couldn't get our male colleagues engaged. Now they're getting engaged. You can see in this room, the number's not perfect, but it's improving.
Yeah,
so
it is good.
I think there's a long way to go. I think respect is a key thing. I think the recent things in this country show respect is still a problem. But I think we're on a good path, a good trajectory, and just what you've done here today, all of you from state.
Thank you. I am going to break in here, because speaking of our male colleagues, my understanding is that one of our male colleagues has arrived, the Deputy Secretary. So help me thank this panel. And really good thoughts, and maybe you can find them afterwards and ask what myth they want to have busted before it's over. Thank you. I'll let you all go to your seats. And I want to introduce a dear friend of mine here at DRL, who is Ambassador Kozak. He's now in charge of DRL and just has been a tremendous Sherpa for me as I've been learning the ropes here at the Department of State. And I'm sure that Ambassador Kozak is here. Yes, he comes in. Would you like to come up and introduce our next speaker? Thank you, Mike.
Well, thank you, Pam, and thank all of you for the work each of you are doing. Violence against women and girls does not only affect women and girls, it affects everyone. And we in DRL, along with our colleagues in the Office of Global Women Issues, are proud to support your efforts. When states have in place the right legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms to address the problem, and when civil society has the capability to change societal attitudes and provide immediate relief to victims, a difference can be made. Best practices you are identifying should be help make a bigger dent in the problem. It's my great pleasure this morning to introduce a man whose entire career has been devoted to promoting the rule of law, including in this area, and who has just returned from a trip to Nigeria, where he witnessed firsthand how violence against women and girls can affect an entire community. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Deputy Secretary John Sullivan.
Thank you, Ambassador Kozak. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and I'm delighted to be here, honored to be able to speak before you. Each year on November 25th, we commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and observe the accompanying 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Those 16 days of activism against gender violence offer a global platform for governments, organizations, individuals around the world to mobilize and call attention to the urgent need to end violence against women and girls across the board. As Ambassador Kozak mentioned, I was just in Nigeria a couple of weeks ago and met with civil society groups, survivors, women and girls, young girls, teenage girls who have endured just the most horrific crimes against them and their families. And so it's a compelling issue for any person, but for us as Americans in particular. Gender-based violence harms individuals, violates the most basic of our inalienable human rights. From sexual assault, early or forced marriage and rape, to dating violence and so-called honor killings, women and girls disproportionately face violence around the world. The statistics, unfortunately, are both shocking and saddening. An estimated 1 out of every 3 women worldwide has been subject to violence, rape, or other abuse in her lifetime. According to the World Health Organization, at least 30% of women worldwide have experienced this kind of violence at the hands of a partner. According to the UN Women, violence against women causes more death and disability for women and girls between the ages of 15 and 44 than cancer, traffic accidents, malaria, and war combined. Finally, in the United States, nearly 1 out of every 3 women and 1 out of every 6 men has experienced some form of sexual violence. Beyond the obvious and direct harm to the individual, violence against women damages society as a whole and stifles or reverses progress made in economic development, health, and security. For instance, radical terrorist organizations, including those which we unfortunately have experience with in Nigeria, directly target women and girls to achieve their ideological and tactical objectives. These attacks on girls in their schools prevent them from receiving an education by keeping them out of the classroom, and alienate them from reaching their full potential as citizens, entrepreneurs, leaders, or just as human beings. And this violence doesn't merely impact the victim, it causes a chain reaction, further contributing to the cycles of poverty and instability we witness in so many countries, impacting not only individuals, but entire societies. Whether it occurs inside or outside of the workplace, violence against women can limit women's ability to fully participate in the economy. It's not an easy topic to talk about. It's often painful. It's emotionally draining to be with the survivors. But we must face it head on if we're going to make any progress. And one of the most important steps to ending this global problem is engaging everyone, including men and boys. Violence against women negatively affects men and boys in 2 ways: directly as survivors of violence, and indirectly through their exposure to it. Study after study has shown that when violence is witnessed or experienced, it's likely to be repeated. Gender-based violence is cyclical. Men who witness violence at an early age are twice as likely to be perpetrators of violence in the future. Similarly, girls who experience abusive relationships early in their lives are at an increased risk of being victimized by others later in life. Engaging men and boys as loving, supportive, and involved husbands and fathers is critical to achieving sustained transformational change. Since its founding in Brazil 20 years ago, our partner, Promundo, working alongside a number of other dedicated partners, has helped to prevent violence in more than 40 countries through high-impact research and evaluation, targeted advocacy efforts, and evidence-based educational programming. Programs like Promundo engage men and boys in the fight against gender-based violence by growing male leadership and promoting gender equality. Promundo encourages men to be active, loving, and equitable caregivers in their roles as fathers. To this end, Promundo has established the Men Care campaign to promote men's involvement as dedicated fathers and caregivers, strengthen families, improve gender equality, and promote better health for the entire family. Promundo has also begun international men and gender equality surveys, or images, which measure men's and women's attitudes and practices around gender equality and violence against women and girls. And today we're excited to celebrate the launch of Voices Against Violence, or VAV, a public-private partnership with the Avon Foundation that provides a comprehensive approach to combating violence against women and engages men and boys to break the cycle, especially in conflict areas. And it's in these conflict areas that the targeted use of violence against women, especially sexual violence and exploitation, is used as a tool of war and sadly perpetrated far too often. From conflicts in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Colombia, and Liberia, to more recent violence by ISIS, Boko Haram, and security forces in Myanmar, we see time and again that women are disproportionately affected in times of crisis. VAV works to engage men and boys on every level. It brings together key stakeholders to leverage skills and best practices that can be utilized globally. By ensuring men and boys are involved in training to prevent violence, it helps other men recognize that this is not just a women's issue and that we need everyone's help to make a change. VAV has begun to conduct regional training on combating violence against women, inviting male judicial actors, law enforcement officials, civil society, and activists to create male champions and advocate for better protections for survivors. Male champions are imperative to breaking the cycle of violence. VAV will serve as an effective new tool for embassies and our bureaus here at State to not only assist survivors of gender-based violence, but also to break the cycle of violence by working directly with men and boys on this issue. Additionally, VAV will help the State Department undertake important initiatives like responding to acid attacks, preventing female genital mutilation, and putting an end to honor killings so that we can protect women across the globe who have nowhere else to turn. Incorporating men and boys to become stout agents of change and advocates to end violence against women and children is an essential element to solving a global problem. We are making progress, but it's just the beginning. There is still much more to be done, and by continuing to work together to promote gender equality and eliminate gender bias, I'm confident that we can make great strides in breaking this cycle of violence. On behalf of Secretary Tillerson, I want to thank you for coming here today. We hope that these important discussions will bring us at least one step closer in our efforts to engage men and boys and put an end to a problem that affects all of us. Thank you very much.
We ask that you please kindly remain seated while the Secretary exits. Thank you.
We want to thank you again for coming today. We hope that you got a lot of important information out of this, and thank you so much for coming. Please keep in touch with us. Please see the SGB website for further information, and thank you so much.